Title: The Shadows Within. Chapter 1: The New Apartment. Elias stood at the entrance of his new apartment, a dreary, windowless space that sat below ground level. The peeling paint and flickering light bulbs gave the place a ghostly air, but it was all he could afford after the breakup that had shattered his world. He stepped inside, the door creaking ominously behind him as he crossed the threshold. The air was stale and cool, carrying a faint smell of dampness, as if the walls themselves were weeping. He flicked the light switch, but the bulb flickered hesitantly before settling into a dull glow that cast long, wavering shadows across the room. The echoes of his footsteps filled the silence, amplifying the sense of isolation that surrounded him. He set down his few belongings, a small suitcase and a few boxes, and took a deep breath, trying to shake off the unease creeping into his mind. This was a fresh start, he told himself, a chance to rediscover who he was. But as night fell, the shadows lengthened and curled into corners, morphing into grotesque shapes that danced just out of sight. Elias tried to distract himself with a movie, but the flickering screen only served to heighten his anxiety. Every creak of the floorboards, every distant sound echoed through the silence, as if the apartment were alive and breathing around him. The oppressive darkness seeped into his thoughts, and with it came an unsettling awareness that he was not alone. He turned off the television, and the silence was deafening. The air felt thick, wrapping around him like a shroud. He tried to convince himself that it was just his imagination, that moving into this basement apartment had simply unsettled him. But deep down, he felt a weight pressing on his chest, a sense of being watched, scrutinized by unseen eyes. Suddenly, a sharp knock echoed from the door, causing Elias to jump. He hesitated, heart racing, wondering who could be visiting this late. Cautiously, he approached the door and peered through the peephole, but there was no one there. Just the darkness of the hallway beyond. He opened the door slightly, peering into the empty corridor. "Hello?" he called, his voice trembling. But silence greeted him in return. Shaking his head, he dismissed it as nerves and returned to his room, attempting to calm his racing heart. That night, as he lay in bed, sleep eluded him. The shadows crept closer, inching toward him like tendrils of smoke, and he couldn't shake the feeling that they were alive, that they were watching him, waiting for the right moment to strike. He squeezed his eyes shut, willing himself to sleep, but the darkness felt suffocating, a living thing pressing down on him. As dawn broke, the sunlight seeped through the cracks of his door, but the sense of dread remained. Elias knew he had to face his fears. He had to make this place feel like home. So, he began unpacking, shoving books onto shelves and hanging clothes in the closet, each movement a desperate attempt to reclaim control over his environment. But as he unpacked, a chill swept through the room, causing the hair on the back of his neck to stand on end. He paused, looking around, and caught a glimpse of movement in the corner of his eye. Something flickered, just out of reach, like a shadow slipping behind the dresser. Elias's heart raced, but when he turned, nothing was there, only the stillness of the room. Chapter 2: Messages Gone Silent. As the days dragged on, the suffocating feeling of being watched only intensified. Elias tried to immerse himself in his writing, pouring his emotions onto the page in an attempt to exorcise the shadows that haunted him. Yet the very act of creation became tainted by the ever-present dread that coiled around his mind. Each word felt heavy, burdened by the weight of his paranoia. He reached out to his friends, texting them about his move and how he was settling in, but the replies were slow in coming. At first, he thought nothing of it. Everyone had their own lives, their own struggles. But as the days turned into weeks and his messages went unanswered, an unsettling sense of isolation began to gnaw at him. He would check his phone obsessively, refreshing the screen as if expecting a response to appear, but there was only silence. One evening, feeling desperate, he called Thomas, his best friend since childhood. The phone rang, but just as he was about to leave a message, it clicked over to voicemail. "Hey, it's Elias. I just wanted to check in. I'm worried. Just give me a call back when you can." His voice wavered at the end, betraying the anxiety that had taken root in his chest. He waited for a response, but the silence felt like a weight pressing down on him. He tried to dismiss the growing dread, but the feeling of abandonment gnawed at his insides. The apartment felt emptier with each unanswered message, the shadows creeping closer, closing in around him. That night, as he lay in bed staring at the ceiling, he heard it, the faint sound of whispers, echoing from the walls. Elias's heart raced as he strained to listen, his breath catching in his throat. Were the voices real, or just a trick of his mind? He could hear snippets of words, indistinguishable yet urgent, like a warning he couldn't quite grasp. Help! Him! Don't go! He bolted upright, eyes wide as panic set in. The whispers swirled around him, growing louder, as if the apartment were alive with the voices of the past. Every creak of the floorboards became a footstep, every rustle of fabric a breath drawing closer. He could feel it, the shadow lurking just beyond his vision, feeding off his fear, whispering secrets he couldn't understand. In a frenzy, he grabbed his phone, hoping to find solace in the familiar light of social media. But when he logged in, the screen flickered and the app crashed, leaving him staring at the dark void. Frustrated, he tried again, but the app wouldn't open. Panic bubbled in his chest. Was it his imagination? Had something cut him off from the world? The whispers intensified, and he squeezed his eyes shut, pressing his hands against his ears to block out the noise. Stop! Just leave me alone! He shouted into the darkness, the emptiness swallowing his voice. Suddenly, the whispers ceased. A heavy silence fell over the room, oppressive and suffocating. He felt the weight of the shadows pressing against him, and for the first time, he sensed their true intent. They weren't just echoes of his mind, they were a warning, a reminder of the darkness lurking in the corners of his psyche. Exhausted and shaken, Elias lay back down, desperately trying to calm his racing heart. He felt as though he were teetering on the edge of madness, the shadows closing in, waiting for him to slip. He knew he couldn't stay in the apartment much longer. Something was terribly wrong, and he needed to escape. Prus Chi, Chapter 3, The Echoes in the Dark. The following days were a blur of anxiety and dread, the shadows growing thicker around him. Elias found himself withdrawing further into the confines of his apartment, avoiding the outside world. Every time he stepped out, he felt the oppressive weight of the shadows clinging to him, a constant reminder of the paranoia that had settled over him like a fog. He spent hours researching the building, searching for any clue that could explain the odd occurrences that had plagued him. But the history was barren, the records filled with mundane details of tenants who had come and gone without leaving a trace. He found no information about previous occupants, no mention of any dark secrets hidden within the walls. One night, driven by an overwhelming need for answers, Elias decided to confront his fears. He took a flashlight and ventured into the dark corners of his apartment, sweeping the beam of light over the walls, searching for signs of the presence that haunted him. As he moved deeper into the apartment, the air grew colder, and he could feel the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. He arrived at a small closet tucked away in the hallway, the door slightly ajar as though inviting him to peek inside. Heart racing, he pushed the door open, revealing a small, cluttered space filled with boxes and old furniture. Dust motes danced in the beam of his flashlight, swirling around him like a storm of lost memories. In the corner of the closet lay an old, weathered trunk. Its surface was coated in dust, the leather cracked and peeling. Curiosity piqued, Elias knelt down and opened the trunk, the hinges creaking as it revealed its secrets. Inside, he found a collection of faded photographs and crumpled letters, remnants of lives lived within these very walls. As he sifted through the contents, he uncovered a series of journals, their pages filled with frantic handwriting. The entries detailed the gradual descent into madness of a previous tenant, each page filled with the same creeping dread that now consumed Elias. The final entry sent chills down his spine. The shadows are alive and they watch me. I can feel them closing in. I must leave before it's too late. The last entry was dated just days before the tenant had vanished without a trace. Eduardo dropped the journals, feeling a cold sweat break out across his forehead. This was more than just paranoia. It was a pattern, a cycle of despair that had claimed those who had come before him. The figure, the shadow, was not merely haunting him. It was an insatiable force that thrived on fear. Chapter 4. The Stranger Online. The days turned into a blur of dread as Elias sank deeper into isolation. The weight of the shadows felt heavier each day, wrapping around him like a suffocating blanket. His mind was a prison, echoing with whispers that never seemed to leave him alone. Every creak of the building settled deeper into his bones, each sound becoming an ominous reminder of the dark presence that lurked just beyond the edges of his reality. Desperate for connection and any semblance of normalcy, he turned to the internet, hoping to find solace in virtual interactions. He scoured forums and social media, seeking advice on anxiety and the strange occurrences that plagued him. But as he typed, he felt a creeping unease settle over him, a sense that the very act of reaching out was futile, that the darkness would snatch away any chance he had of escaping his nightmare. Late one night, he stumbled upon a thread titled "Things That Haunt You," filled with chilling accounts from people who had experienced the supernatural. In the middle of reading a particularly unsettling story, a private message popped up on his screen. The sender was a user named Echo, who seemed to know unsettling details about Elias's situation. "I know what you're experiencing," the message read. "You're being followed. You have to be careful." Elias's heart raced as he read the words. How could this stranger know what was happening to him? Against his better judgment, he typed back, asking for more information. He felt a mixture of hope and dread as he awaited a response, but the answer came quickly. "The darkness is alive in your apartment," Echo replied. "It feeds on fear. It will watch you, and it will never let you go. I once lived there, and I barely escaped." Elias stared at the screen, heart pounding. A chill ran down his spine as he considered the implications. Had Echo experienced the same horrors he was now enduring? The shadowy figure? The whispers? He felt a strange kinship with this stranger, a bond formed through shared fear. As they continued to chat, Echo shared chilling details about their time in the same apartment. They spoke of the suffocating darkness that closed in at night, of figures lurking just out of sight, and of whispers that promised madness. "You need to leave," Echo urged. "The shadows will take you if you don't." But Elias was frozen, caught in a cycle of fear and denial. Part of him wanted to flee, to run from the apartment that had become a prison of his own making. Yet another part held him back, the fear of the unknown rooting him in place. That night, the apartment felt different. The air was thick with tension, and shadows seemed to writhe in the corners, taunting him with their presence. He tried to distract himself with his phone, scrolling through the messages from Echo, searching for a way to break free from the grip of despair. Suddenly, he noticed that the texts from Echo had grown erratic. They began to take on an unsettling tone, filled with frantic warnings and cryptic phrases that sent shivers down his spine. "It's getting stronger," one message read. "You must act fast. It knows you're aware." Elias felt a cold dread creeping over him. He had tried to convince himself that the threat was just a figment of his imagination, a result of his overactive mind. But now the shadows seemed to whisper his name. The feeling of being watched intensified, as if the figure had seeped through the walls and was standing right behind him. With a sense of urgency, he typed back, "What should I do?" But there was no response. Minutes turned into an hour, and just as he began to lose hope, a new message appeared. "It's coming for you." The words sent a jolt of fear coursing through him. Suddenly the room was filled with a chilling silence, the air thick with anticipation. Elias felt an overwhelming sense of dread, as if the shadows themselves had heard the message and were preparing to strike. Chapter start from Chapter 5. The echoes in the dark sleep was a distant memory, a fleeting concept that danced just out of reach, as the fear had wrapped around Elias like a vice. Every night felt longer than the last, the darkness becoming an oppressive force that suffocated him. The more he tried to escape it, the more it tightened its grip. In the stillness of the night, the whispers returned. They slithered through the cracks in the walls, curling around him like tendrils of smoke. At first, he thought he could make out words, fragments of conversations long forgotten, but the sounds shifted, becoming a cacophony of disjointed murmurs, echoing in his mind. He pressed his hands to his ears, trying to drown out the sound, but it only grew louder, reverberating through his skull. "Help us! Leave! Don't stay!" The echo of those voices felt suffocating, and Elias felt himself unraveling. He struggled to maintain a grasp on reality, questioning what was real and what was born from his mind's descent into chaos. The fear tightened around him, constricting as he felt the shadow growing bolder. He could sense it in the dark corners of the room, lurking just beyond the reach of his flashlight, waiting for him to break. One evening, desperate for a distraction, Elias tried to tidy up the clutter in his apartment. As he rummaged through the stacks of books and boxes, he stumbled upon an old mirror he had almost forgotten about. Its surface was dusty and cracked, reflecting a distorted version of himself, the light failing to illuminate his features fully. A sense of dread washed over him as he remembered the warning from Echo. The darkness is alive in your apartment. He couldn't shake the feeling that the mirror held more than just his reflection. He reached out tentatively, wiping away the dust with trembling fingers. The moment he did, the reflection shifted, and for a brief moment he swore he saw a shadow moving behind him, a figure standing just out of sight. His heart raced as he turned to look, but once again there was nothing there. But when he glanced back at the mirror, the figure had changed. It was no longer a fleeting shadow, but a dark, menacing shape, with glowing eyes, staring back at him from the depths of the glass. Elias stumbled backward, his breath quickening as the figure seemed to lean closer, its mouth opening into a silent scream. Panic surged through him as he turned away from the mirror, but the sound of shattering glass made him freeze. He looked back to find the mirror cracked, shards glinting menacingly, reflecting 1,000 different versions of himself, each one twisted, distorted, and shadowed. In that moment, he understood. The shadow had found a way in. It wasn't just haunting him, it was using his fears against him, feeding on his anxiety, thriving in the chaos of his mind. Desperate, he ran from the room, seeking refuge in the confines of his bedroom. The walls felt like they were closing in, the shadows coiling tighter around him as he collapsed onto the bed, heart racing. But the darkness didn't relent. He could feel it pressing down, a weight suffocating him, whispering terrible truths he wasn't ready to confront. In the quiet that followed, the whispers returned, but now they were clearer, more insistent. You can't hide. You belong to us. The chilling realization washed over him. He was losing his grip on reality. The shadow was winning. Chapter 6. The Burden of Memory. The days blurred together, each one slipping into the next like a bad dream he couldn't wake from. The nights, however, were the worst. Long, haunted stretches of time where the shadows crept closer, wrapping around Elias like a suffocating shroud. He spent more hours locked in his bedroom, the darkness becoming his only companion. But even that turned treacherous. Elias had tried to ignore the creeping dread that nestled itself within his heart, but it became increasingly difficult as he relived the horrors of the past. The guilt he had long buried, his friend Luis, the hill, the dare, came crashing down upon him like a tidal wave, relentless and unforgiving. Every time he closed his eyes, he was met with vivid flashes of that night, the laughter that had once filled the air now twisted into something dark and sinister. One particular night, he felt the weight of the shadows pressing in on him, the air thick and oppressive. He lay curled up under the blankets, trying to drown out the whispers that echoed in his mind. You left him. You let him fall. The words replayed like a broken record. Gnawing at his sanity, desperate for an escape, he decided to confront the truth that had haunted him for so long. The thought of doing so sent chills racing down his spine, but he knew he had to face it. Gritting his teeth, he willed himself to relive the memory of Luis. In his mind, he pictured the hillside, moonlight spilling over the path, casting long shadows that danced around them. The two of them had laughed, joking about how brave they were, how they could conquer anything together. But as he climbed, he felt that old familiar weight of dread settle in his stomach, the nagging thought that he had pushed his friend too far. The moment the laughter had faded, the memory twisted into a nightmare. He could see Luis slipping, grasping at the air as he tumbled down the slope. Time slowed, every detail etched into his mind. The look of sheer terror on Luis's face, the panicked screams echoing in the still night, and then nothing. The silence that had followed was deafening, a void that swallowed every trace of life and joy. Elias squeezed his eyes shut, trying to block out the memories, but they overwhelmed him, crashing down like an avalanche. He felt as if he were falling, plummeting down that very hill alongside Luis, the darkness closing in around him. The shadows flickered at the edges of his vision, morphing into distorted shapes, twisted faces, and ghostly figures that taunted him with their whispers. "Why did you leave me, Elias?" The voice was soft yet piercing, echoing through his mind like a ghostly wail. Elias opened his eyes, heart pounding, as he realized he was no longer alone. The shadows had shifted, taking on a form, and there in the corner of the room stood the figure, dark, twisted, and unmistakably familiar. Luis. His friend's face was pale and gaunt, the familiar spark in his eyes replaced with hollow emptiness. Elias felt a jolt of terror course through him as he took in the sight, the very essence of his guilt materializing before him. The figure stepped closer, shadows trailing behind him like smoke, wrapping around his limbs. "You abandoned me," Luis said, his voice echoing, reverberating with pain. "You left me to die." Elias felt bile rise in his throat, choking him as he struggled to find words. "Luis, I didn't mean to. I thought you were right behind me. I thought—" The figure raised a hand, and the shadow surged forward, enveloping Elias. He gasped as the darkness wrapped around him, pulling him closer, suffocating him with the weight of his regret. "You thought?" Luis's voice dripped with bitterness, each word slicing through Elias like a blade. "I was scared!" Elias cried, tears streaming down his face. "I didn't know! I never wanted this to happen!" But the figure was unyielding, drawing closer, the shadows twisting around Elias's limbs, holding him fast. "You chose to run," it whispered, its breath cold against his skin. "You chose your own life over mine, and now you will pay the price." Panic surged through him as the darkness tightened its grip, stealing the air from his lungs. He fought against it, clawing at the shadows, but they were relentless, binding him in a vice of guilt and despair. "I'm sorry," he screamed, but the words felt hollow in the face of the shadow's wrath. In that moment, Elias understood. The shadows were not just figments of his imagination. They were manifestations of his guilt, of the choices he had made. And now, they had come to collect their due. With every ounce of strength he could muster, he summoned the memories of his friendship with Luis, the laughter they had shared, the dreams they had built together. "I loved you, Luis," he cried out, desperate for forgiveness, desperate to break free from the darkness that threatened to consume him. "I never meant to leave you." For a heartbeat, the shadows hesitated, their grip loosening just slightly. The figure faltered, and for the first time, he saw a flicker of something in Luis's eyes. Pain, perhaps, or maybe understanding, but it was quickly swallowed by the darkness. "Face the truth, Elias," Luis whispered. And with that, the shadows surged forward, and he was plunged into the depths of darkness once more. In the depths of his despair, Elias realized that to escape this torment, he must confront the truth he had long feared, the guilt that had bound him, the friendship he had betrayed. Only by accepting the weight of his past could he hope to reclaim his future. Chapter 7. The Living Walls. The darkness in the apartment pressed down on Elias, suffocating him, wrapping around him like a thick fog that refused to lift. Shadows slithered along the walls, growing thicker, more defined, whispering secrets he could not understand. Every corner of his mind screamed that he needed to escape. But the very air he breathed felt charged with a dark energy, as if the apartment itself had become a living entity, intent on trapping him within its grasp. After the harrowing confrontation with the figure of Luis, Elias knew he could no longer remain a passive participant in this nightmare. The shadows were alive, feeding off his guilt, and he felt them encroaching on his sanity. He had to uncover the truth, whatever secrets lay hidden within these walls. Clenching his fists, he resolved to confront the darkness head-on, hoping to reclaim his own mind from its suffocating grip. He began his search that night, the oppressive silence of the apartment echoing in his ears. With a flickering flashlight in hand, he crept through the narrow halls, the beam of light dancing across the peeling wallpaper and darkened corners. Each creak of the floorboards beneath his feet sounded like the whispers of long-dead souls, urging him to turn back, to retreat into the safety of ignorance. Elias stopped in front of the wall adjacent to his bedroom. Something about it felt different, as though it held a secret, a memory buried deep within its surface. The air was colder here, an unsettling chill creeping into his bones. He pressed his palm against the wall, feeling the texture beneath his fingers. Rough, uneven, and somehow alive. Suddenly, a vision flickered through his mind. A blurred image of the previous tenant standing before this very wall, scratching at the surface, desperately trying to escape something unseen. A chill ran down Elias's spine as he recalled the journal entries, the accounts of those who had come before him. The walls are alive. They watch. They know. With trembling hands, Elias retrieved a small tool from his pocket and began to scrape away at the paint, revealing the rough surface beneath. Each stroke felt like a violation, a disturbance of something ancient and powerful, but he pressed on, driven by a mix of fear and determination. The whispers grew louder as he dug deeper, a cacophony of voices rising to fill the air, calling his name in a chorus of agony. "Help us! Help us!" The pleas echoed in his mind, pulling at his heartstrings. Panic surged through him, but he pressed on, scratching and scraping until the wall began to yield. Suddenly, with a sickening crack, a section of the wall crumbled away, revealing a hidden cavity within. Elias's breath hitched as he peered into the darkness beyond. What lay inside sent chills racing down his spine. He could see old, crumpled photographs scattered like forgotten dreams, remnants of the lives that had once filled this space. Faces stared back at him, smiling, laughing, and then, abruptly, they transformed into expressions of terror, mouths open in silent screams. Among the debris, he noticed something glimmering faintly, a small silver locket. Elias reached for it, feeling a strange pull, as if the locket were calling to him. But as he touched it, a rush of memories surged through him, overwhelming and violent. The room spun around him, the walls pulsating with energy as voices flooded his mind. "We were here! We were trapped!" He stumbled back, clutching the locket tightly as visions assaulted him. He saw the faces of the previous tenants, all swallowed by despair, their lives absorbed into the very walls he stood against. He felt their terror, their panic, as they realized that they were not just living in the apartment, but were part of it, intertwined in a tapestry of fear that the building had woven around them. The shadow of Luis lurked in the periphery of his mind, a reminder of his own guilt, urging him to understand the truth that had long eluded him. The apartment had absorbed their pain, their memories, feeding on their suffering and now reaching for him. He was next. Elias stumbled away from the wall, gasping for air as the oppressive weight of their collective anguish pressed down on him. The whispers intensified, rising to a deafening roar, drowning out his thoughts. He dropped the locket, letting it fall to the floor, where it clinked softly against the wood. Suddenly, the lights flickered ominously, plunging the room into darkness for a moment. When they flickered back on, Elias found himself face to face with the shadow, its form materializing from the very walls, contorted and grotesque, its glowing eyes burning with fury. "You've awakened them!" it hissed, the sound reverberating through the room like thunder. "Now you will join them." Elias's heart raced as he backed away, the shadows swirling around him, tightening their grip. He could feel their anguish, their sorrow, and it was suffocating. He realized now that the shadow was not merely a figment of his imagination, but a manifestation of all the pain that had been trapped within these walls. With a sudden surge of determination, he grabbed the locket and hurled it at the shadow. "No! I won't be part of this!" he shouted, the words tearing from his throat as he fought against the suffocating darkness. The locket struck the shadow and shattered, a burst of light illuminating the room. For a brief moment, the screams turned to wails, a chorus of voices released from their prison. But the shadow only grew angrier, its form swelling and distorting, fueled by Elias's defiance. "You cannot escape!" it roared, and as it lunged at him, Elias turned and ran, the shadows closing in behind him, eager to claim him as one of their own. The walls felt alive, twisting and shifting, and he could hear the desperate whispers of those who had come before him, urging him to find a way out before it was too late. Chapter 8. Echo returns. Elias ran blindly through the winding corridors of his apartment, the weight of the shadows pressing heavily on his back. The air felt electric, crackling with an energy that sent shivers racing down his spine. The whispers had turned into a cacophony of screams, a chorus of lost souls pleading for release, their cries echoing in his mind like a relentless storm. Every step he took felt heavier, as though the very floor was trying to pull him under. He could hear it behind him, the shadow, its presence growing closer, the air thickening with malevolence. "You cannot escape," it hissed, its voice a chilling blend of his own thoughts and those of the lost tenants. Each word felt like a dagger in his heart, piercing through the shroud of his sanity. Desperation clawed at him as he raced toward the exit, but the walls twisted and contorted, the familiar layout of his apartment becoming a nightmarish maze. Each door he tried was locked, each window sealed tight, as if the building itself conspired to keep him inside. Panic surged within him, flooding his veins with adrenaline, and he could almost taste the fear that lingered in the air. Then, in the midst of the chaos, a figure materialized before him. Echo, the stranger who had warned him, now taking on a ghostly form, flickering like a candle caught in the wind. Elias skidded to a halt, breathless, his heart pounding as he took in the sight. Echo's eyes glowed with an otherworldly light, filled with a mix of urgency and despair. "You have to listen to me," Echo shouted, their voice barely audible over the tumultuous noise of the shadows. "It's trying to take you. You have to confront it." Elias felt his breath catch in his throat, his mind racing. Confront it? The thought terrified him. The last time he had faced the shadow, it had nearly consumed him. But as the shadows closed in, their whispers growing louder, he knew he had no choice. "What do I do?" he gasped, desperation flooding his voice. "How can I fight it?" Echo reached out, their hands shimmering in the dim light. "You must face your guilt," they urged, their eyes locked onto his. "Only by confronting your past can you weaken its hold over you. Remember, it feeds on your fear." The walls trembled around them, the shadows swaying and flickering as if they were alive. Elias could feel the darkness clawing at him, tugging at the very core of his being. He knew Echo was right. He had to confront the memories that haunted him, the pain he had buried deep within. But the thought of reliving that night, the fear, the guilt, made his stomach churn. Suddenly, the shadow loomed closer, its form twisting and distorting as it advanced. "You can't escape your fate," it roared, the voice echoing with the cries of those who had vanished before him. The temperature dropped, and a cold wind swept through the hallway, chilling him to the bone. In that moment, something ignited within Elias, a flicker of defiance sparked by desperation. "No!" he shouted, his voice rising above the chaos. "I won't let you take me!" As he declared his intention, he felt a surge of power coursing through him. The darkness hesitated, momentarily thrown off balance by his determination. This was his moment. He had to seize it. With a newfound resolve, he turned to Echo, who nodded encouragingly, urging him forward. "Face your past!" Echo shouted, their voice barely rising above the shadows. Elias took a deep breath, summoning the strength to confront the memories that had long haunted him. In his mind, he pictured that night, the hill, the laughter shared with Luis, and the moment everything had changed. He could see Luis standing there, fear flickering in his eyes as he slipped, reaching out for help. "Elias!" The echo of his voice cried out, drowning in the silence of the dark abyss. "Luis!" Elias called, feeling the weight of his guilt crashing down around him. "I'm sorry, I should have saved you." The shadow roared in fury, the air thickening with rage, but Elias pressed on, determined to break the cycle of fear. "I abandoned you!" he cried, the words ripping from his throat, raw and agonizing. "I let my fear take control, and I ran." The shadow twisted violently, the whispers growing frantic, echoing his confession. Elias felt a wave of energy pulse through him, pushing back against the suffocating darkness. "I was scared. I was so afraid of losing everything that I didn't see you needed me. I should have been there." As he spoke, the shadows flickered, revealing flashes of the past, the laughter, the friendship, the warmth of a bond unbroken. For the first time, he felt the weight of his guilt begin to lift, the suffocating darkness retreating in the face of his confession. With every word, the figure shrank, its anger dissipating like mist in the morning sun. "You cannot escape," it howled, but its voice was faltering, weak against the strength of Elias's acknowledgement. The air crackled with energy as the walls trembled, and the darkness began to peel away, revealing the warm glow of memories long hidden. Echo stepped closer, their forms stabilizing, shimmering with encouragement. "Remember, the darkness cannot hold you if you embrace the light," Echo urged, their voice firm. Elias took a step forward, his heart pounding in his chest as he faced the shadow. "I am not afraid of you anymore," he shouted, the power of his words echoing through the apartment. "I will not be your prisoner. I will free myself." With that declaration, the shadow let out one final agonized roar, dissolving into a swirling mist that filled the room before bursting outward, scattering into the ether. Elias stood in the silence that followed, breathless and trembling, but a sense of lightness filled the air, the oppressive darkness lifting as the whispers faded into nothingness. In that moment, Elias knew he had faced the demons of his past, the shadows that had haunted him for so long. He had broken the cycle, and now, for the first time in what felt like an eternity, he was free. Chapter 8. Echo returns. Elias ran blindly through the winding corridors of his apartment, the weight of the shadows pressing heavily on his back. The air felt electric, crackling with an energy that sent shivers racing down his spine. The whispers had turned into a cacophony of screams, a chorus of lost souls pleading for release, their cries echoing in his mind like a relentless storm. Every step he took felt heavier, as though the very floor was trying to pull him under. He could hear it behind him, the shadow, its presence growing closer, the air thickening with malevolence. "You cannot escape," it hissed, its voice a chilling blend of his own thoughts and those of the lost tenants. Each word felt like a dagger in his heart, piercing through the shroud of his sanity. Desperation clawed at him as he raced toward the exit, but the walls twisted and contorted, the familiar layout of his apartment becoming a nightmarish maze. Each door he tried was locked, each window sealed tight, as if the building itself conspired to keep him inside. Panic surged within him, flooding his veins with adrenaline, and he could almost taste the fear that lingered in the air. Then, in the midst of the chaos, a figure materialized before him, Echo, the stranger who had warned him, now taking on a ghostly form, flickering like a candle caught in the wind. Elias skidded to a halt, breathless, his heart pounding as he took in the sight. Echo's eyes glowed with an otherworldly light, filled with a mix of urgency and despair. "You have to listen to me," Echo shouted, their voice barely audible over the tumultuous noise of the shadows. "It's trying to take you. You have to confront it." Elias felt his breath catch in his throat, his mind racing. Confront it. The thought terrified him. The last time he had faced the shadow, it had nearly consumed him. But as the shadows closed in, their whispers growing louder, he knew he had no choice. "What do I do?" he gasped, desperation flooding his voice. "How can I fight it?" Echo reached out, their hands shimmering in the dim light. "You must face your guilt," they urged, their eyes locked onto his. "Only by confronting your past can you weaken its hold over you. Remember, it feeds on your fear." The walls trembled around them, the shadows swaying and flickering as if they were alive. Elias could feel the darkness clawing at him, tugging at the very core of his being. He knew Echo was right. He had to confront the memories that haunted him, the pain he had buried deep within. But the thought of reliving that night, the fear, the guilt, made his stomach churn. Suddenly, the shadow loomed closer, its form twisting and distorting as it advanced. "You can't escape your fate," it roared, the voice echoing with the cries of those who had vanished before him. The temperature dropped, and a cold wind swept through the hallway, chilling him to the bone. In that moment, something ignited within Elias, a flicker of defiance sparked by desperation. "No!" he shouted, his voice rising above the chaos. "I won't let you take me." As he declared his intention, he felt a surge of power coursing through him. The darkness hesitated, momentarily thrown off balance by his determination. This was his moment. He had to seize it. With a newfound resolve, he turned to Echo, who nodded encouragingly, urging him forward. Face your past, Echo shouted, their voice barely rising above the shadows. Elias took a deep breath, summoning the strength to confront the memories that had long haunted him. In his mind, he pictured that night, the hill, the laughter shared with Luis, and the moment everything had changed. He could see Luis standing there, fear flickering in his eyes as he slipped, reaching out for help. Elias! The echo of his voice cried out, drowning in the silence of the dark abyss. Luis! Elias called, feeling the weight of his guilt crashing down around him. I'm sorry! I should have saved you. The shadow roared in fury, the air thickening with rage, but Elias pressed on, determined to break the cycle of fear. I abandoned you, he cried, the words ripping from his throat, raw and agonizing. I let my fear take control and I ran. The shadow twisted violently, the whispers growing frantic, echoing his confession. Elias felt a wave of energy pulse through him, pushing back against the suffocating darkness. I was scared. I was so afraid of losing everything that I didn't see you needed me. I should have been there. As he spoke, the shadows flickered, revealing flashes of the past, the laughter, the friendship, the warmth of a bond unbroken. For the first time, he felt the weight of his guilt begin to lift, the suffocating darkness retreating in the face of his confession. With every word, the figure shrank, its anger dissipating like mist in the morning sun. You cannot escape, it howled, but its voice was faltering, weak against the strength of Elias's acknowledgement. The air crackled with energy as the walls trembled, and the darkness began to peel away, revealing the warm glow of memories long hidden. Echo stepped closer, their forms stabilizing, shimmering with encouragement. Remember, the darkness cannot hold you if you embrace the light, Echo urged, their voice firm. Elias took a step forward, his heart pounding in his chest as he faced the shadow. I am not afraid of you anymore, he shouted, the power of his words echoing through the apartment. I will not be your prisoner. I will free myself. With that declaration, the shadow let out one final agonized roar, dissolving into a swirling mist that filled the room before bursting outward, scattering into the ether. Elias stood in the silence that followed, breathless and trembling, but a sense of lightness filled the air, the oppressive darkness lifting as the whispers faded into nothingness. In that moment, Elias knew he had faced the demons of his past, the shadows that had haunted him for so long. He had broken the cycle, and now, for the first time in what felt like an eternity, he was free. Chapter 9. The Final Confrontation. The air was electric as Elias stood at the top of the hill, the memories of that fateful night crashing down upon him like waves of sorrow. The moon hung low in the sky, casting an eerie glow over the landscape, illuminating the twisted branches of the trees that loomed like skeletal fingers reaching toward the heavens. Shadows danced along the ground, their movements frantic and chaotic, as if eager to swallow him whole. Elias felt his heart race, the chill of fear gripping him as he gazed down the slope. He could still picture Luis's laughter echoing through the night, the carefree joy that had transformed into a scream of terror that had haunted him for years. He clenched his fists, trying to push aside the guilt that clawed at him. This is it, he thought. You have to face it. As he took a tentative step forward, the wind picked up, howling through the trees, carrying with it the whispers of the lost souls that had come before him. You can't escape, they murmured, their voices blending into a chilling chorus that seeped into his bones. Elias shook his head, pushing the voices away, reminding himself of Echo's words. You are not as lost as you think. He had to confront his past, to find the courage buried deep within him. With each step, he felt the darkness closing in, a palpable presence that watched and waited. At the bottom of the hill, he stopped, his breath caught in his throat. The memories surged to the forefront of his mind, and suddenly he was there again, standing with Luis on that very spot, daring him to climb higher, to take risks that would lead to tragedy. Why did I let you go? He whispered, the guilt flooding back with an intensity that nearly brought him to his knees. The shadows coiled around him, twisting and writhing as they responded to his despair. You left him. You abandoned him. The whispers grew louder, echoing through the night, clawing at his sanity. Elias staggered back, the weight of his regret threatening to crush him. Then, from the depths of the darkness, a figure began to take shape, a twisted silhouette of Luis, his face a mask of sorrow and anger. "You didn't come for me," the figure said, voice echoing with a pain that cut deep into Elias's heart. "You ran away." "No, I was scared," Elias cried, tears streaming down his face. "I thought I could save you. I didn't know what to do." The figure stepped closer, its form flickering like a candle in the wind. "You had a choice, Elias. You chose to abandon me." The air grew heavy with tension, and Elias felt a surge of desperation clawing at his insides. "I was just a kid. I didn't know," he shouted, his voice breaking. "I thought you would follow. I thought you were right behind me." Luis's shadow shifted, the sorrow in his eyes morphing into something darker, a deep penetrating anger that made Elias's blood run cold. "You thought wrong," the figure hissed, its voice now a chilling whisper that curled around him. "You let me fall. You were too afraid to help." As the words struck him, a wave of realization crashed over Elias. The shadows were not just tormenting him, they were echoing his deepest fears, amplifying his guilt and despair. He felt the oppressive weight of their accusations, the anger of those who had come before him. "No!" he shouted, shaking his head. "I won't let you take me! I refuse to be a part of this!" The wind howled in response, a deafening roar that threatened to drown him in its fury. But in that moment, Elias felt a flicker of hope. The memories, the laughter, the friendship, the bond he shared with Luis were not just sources of pain. They were a part of him, a part he could reclaim. "Luis!" he called, desperation lacing his voice. "I loved you. I never wanted to leave you." The shadow flickered, momentarily taken aback by the force of Elias's words. The air crackled with tension, and for a brief moment, the whispers quieted, leaving behind an unsettling silence. "Remember our dreams?" Elias pressed on, feeling the energy shift. "Remember how we said we'd conquer everything together? I didn't mean to abandon you. I was scared. I should have been there for you." As he spoke, the shadows began to pulse, the darkness swirling around him in a chaotic dance. The figure of Luis hesitated, the anger in his eyes dimming as uncertainty crept in. The tension in the air became palpable, as if the very fabric of reality was bending and warping around them. Elias took a step closer, heart racing, determined to bridge the chasm between them. "I need you to forgive me," he said, his voice steady, resonating with an urgency that sent a shiver through the night. "I need to let go of this guilt, and I can't do it without you. I can't let this darkness win." The shadow shuddered, wavering in the flickering light of the moon. For a fleeting moment, Elias thought he saw the flicker of his friend's smile, the warmth of their bond breaking through the cold despair. But then, with a violent surge, the shadow lunged at him, and Elias braced himself, ready to confront the darkness. "Elias!" the figure shouted, and the shadows howled in fury as they coiled around him. He could feel their anger pressing against him, the weight of their anguish threatening to swallow him whole. "Let me go!" he screamed, rage and determination fueling his voice. The memories surged within him, the joy and pain intertwining as he fought against the darkness. "I will not be your prisoner. I refuse to let you take me." With every ounce of strength, he pushed back against the tide of shadows, feeling the energy swell within him. "I loved you, Luis. I will carry you with me, but I will not be consumed by the darkness." The shadows screamed, a cacophony of voices rising in protest as they struggled against his defiance. The figure of Luis flickered, wavering in and out of focus, but Elias pressed on, feeling the warmth of their friendship wrap around him like a shield. As the darkness recoiled, the air grew lighter, the oppressive weight lifting from his shoulders. For a moment, he felt the presence of Luis beside him, a comforting warmth that surged through his veins. "I forgive you." Luis's voice echoed softly, a gentle whisper that calmed the storm within. "You've faced your fears, now it's time to let go." And with those words, the shadows dissipated, fading into the night as the moon shone down, illuminating the hill with a brilliant light. Elias felt a rush of relief, the burden of guilt lifting from his chest. The darkness that had haunted him for so long finally banished. Standing on that hillside, Elias knew he had faced the heart of his darkness, that he had reclaimed his memories and his future. The shadows had lost their grip, and as he looked up at the stars, He felt free for the first time in years. He could carry Luis's memory with him, not as a weight, but as a guiding light, a reminder that he was not alone. Chapter 10. Breaking Free. The moon hung high in the sky, casting a silvery glow over the hillside as Elias stood amidst the remnants of his confrontation. He felt the cool breeze against his skin, the shadows that had once encircled him, now receding into the darkness of the night. The oppressive weight that had burdened him for so long seemed to lift, replaced by a fragile sense of hope. Yet even as the shadows faded, a part of him remained wary, knowing that darkness often finds a way to creep back in when least expected. Elias took a deep breath, grounding himself in the stillness that surrounded him. The weight of the guilt that had haunted him for years was finally beginning to dissipate, but the echoes of Luis's voice still lingered in the corners of his mind. "You've faced your fears, now it's time to let go." Those words resonated within him, a reminder of the bond they had shared, a bond that could never truly be severed. As he began to make his way back down the hill, a shiver ran down his spine. The path felt unfamiliar, twisted in a way that made him question whether he had truly escaped the darkness. The forest around him loomed, trees swaying in the night breeze, their branches clawing at the sky like skeletal fingers reaching for him. Every snap of a twig sent ripples of anxiety through his veins, each rustle of leaves a reminder that he was not out of danger yet. Suddenly, he heard it, the whispers returning, soft and insidious, curling around his thoughts like smoke. "You can't escape." They echoed through the trees, growing louder, swelling into a cacophony of voices that clawed at his sanity. Elias squeezed his eyes shut, fighting against the rising tide of fear that threatened to pull him back into the depths of despair. He had faced the shadows, confronted his guilt. He couldn't let them reclaim him now. But as he stumbled forward, the path grew darker, the light from the moon obscured by an unnatural fog that rolled in, thick and suffocating. The whispers morphed into a single, chilling voice that reverberated through the mist. "You thought you could escape?" Elias's heart raced, the sound reverberating through his very bones. He felt the shadows closing in, an unseen force tugging at him, drawing him back into their embrace. Panic surged within him as he picked up his pace, the fog swirling around his legs like a predator stalking its prey. Then he saw it, a flicker of movement in the distance. The figure of Luis appeared through the mist, but this time it was different. The once gentle features twisted into a mask of fury and betrayal, eyes glowing with an unnatural light. "You left me behind!" the figure screamed, its voice echoing with the anguish of countless lost souls. "Luis! No!" Elias shouted, his voice thick with emotion. The apparition loomed closer, the fog swirling around it as the whispers of the shadows crescendoed into a maddening roar. "You can't run from your past!" Elias felt the ground tremble beneath him, the world around him shifting and warping as the shadows pressed in. He was being drawn back into the very darkness he had fought so hard to escape. The figure of Luis stretched its hand toward him, the shadowy tendrils reaching out, grasping, pulling him closer. "You need to face me!" Luis's voice echoed, now distorted and terrifying. "You think you can just walk away? You have to remember!" Elias staggered back, fear gripping him. "I did remember! I faced the darkness! But as he spoke, the mist thickened, enveloping him in a suffocating embrace. The ground beneath him felt unstable, as though he were standing on the edge of a precipice. "You abandoned me!" the voice of Luis thundered, echoing through the fog. "Face your guilt, Elias!" With a rush of defiance, Elias clutched his head, fighting against the weight of the shadows that threatened to pull him down. "I'm not afraid of you," he shouted, desperation lacing his voice. "I'm not afraid anymore." In that moment, he realized that the darkness was not just a force outside him. It was a manifestation of his own fears, his own unresolved guilt. To break free, he had to embrace that truth, to confront the memories that had shaped him. "Luis," he called out, his voice steadying. "I loved you. I never wanted to lose you." "I'm so sorry." The mist swirled violently, and for a moment, the figure faltered. The anguished expression on Luis's face flickered, revealing the pain and sorrow that had bound them both. "I should have saved you," Elias continued, tears streaming down his face. I can't change the past, but I can carry you with me. I can't let you go, but I will not let the darkness consume me." With those words, a surge of light erupted from within him, piercing through the fog. The shadows screamed, their voices blending into a furious howl. But Elias stood firm, the light illuminating the path before him. The figure of Luis shimmered, wavering in the light, caught between the shadow and the hope Elias had ignited within himself. "You can't escape this," it cried. But there was a tremor in its voice, a flicker of uncertainty that Elias seized upon. "Yes, I can!" he shouted, feeling the warmth of their bond, the love that had transcended the darkness. "I will not let you drown me in guilt any longer. I choose to remember the joy we shared." With each proclamation, the light grew stronger, dispelling the shadows that sought to reclaim him. The whispers became frantic, the darkness swirling around him in a desperate attempt to hold onto its grip. But Elias pressed on, feeling the weight of his guilt lift, replaced by the warmth of cherished memories. "I forgive you," he whispered, knowing he needed to forgive himself as well. "I'll carry you with me, but I won't let the past define my future." As he spoke those final words, the figure of Luis dissolved into the light, a gentle smile breaking through the anguish. The darkness screeched one last time, but it was no match for the purity of hope that now enveloped Elias. The fog lifted, revealing the moonlit hillside, the stars shining brightly above him. Elias collapsed to his knees, breathless but free, the burdens of his past finally lifted. The whispers faded into nothingness, and the shadows dissolved into the night. He had faced the darkness, confronted the shadows that had haunted him for so long, and emerged victorious. As he sat there under the vast sky, he felt an overwhelming sense of peace wash over him, a lightness in his heart he hadn't known in years. Elias knew that the journey wasn't over. There would be moments when the darkness would try to creep back in, when guilt would threaten to resurface. But he also knew he had the strength to face it, to embrace the memories of his past while forging a new path for the future. As he looked up at the stars, he whispered a silent promise to Luis and to himself. "I will remember you, but I will not be bound by you." And with that, he rose to his feet, ready to walk away from the shadows, into the light of a new beginning.